Flying low over the city of Caracas, US Special Forces breached the presidential compound and seized Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, who were swiftly extracted and airlifted to a US Navy ship in the Caribbean before being flown to the headquarters of the Drug Enforcement Administration in New York. Maduro was wanted by the US for a slew of charges, including narco-terrorism and conspiracy to import cocaine. President Trump publicly announced Maduro's capture, framing Operation Absolute Resolve as a law enforcement action with the aim of arresting Maduro on drug trafficking and weapons-related charges. On the 5th of January, Maduro and his wife were arraigned in a New York court where they pleaded not guilty to federal drug trafficking charges and attempted to challenge being brought to the US against their will. The foundations of this charge had been laid months, if not years, prior.
They have obtained the support of the Maduro regime, who is allowing them to use Venezuela as a safe haven from which they can continue to conduct their cocaine trafficking.
The first Trump administration accused Maduro of heading an organized criminal group known as Cartel de los Soles, the Cartel of the Suns, a name that's been in the media since even before Hugo Chavez and Chavismo swept into power in 1999 with his Bolivarian revolution. At the start of his second term, President Trump signed an executive order which designated 8 other organized criminal groups as foreign terrorist organizations, including Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua and Cartel de los Soles.
They were sent by Maduro to terrorize our people, and now Maduro will never again be able to threaten an American citizen.
But the US Department of Justice later dropped the claim that Cartel de los Soles was an actual group.
First, there's not really any evidence of it, and secondly, it's a poor understanding of what that term is. So the term Cartel de los Soles is a term that really started to be used by journalists probably around the 1990s to refer to the fact that the military was very corrupt, was involved in illicit activities, right? So the concept itself, the name itself actually emerges before Chavez comes into office. So if this group did exist, it would have pre-existed Chavez. But journalists really use this as a term to refer to the fact that, look, the military are engaged in illicit activities and corruption, and we know that under Maduro that has increased significantly, right? It is absolutely the case that there is much more drug trafficking, much more illicit activities in the country now than what existed before Chavismo.
In August, the Trump administration increased the reward on offer for Maduro's capture to $50 million, doubling the reward money offered under former President Joe Biden, after which the US began to progressively build up military strength in the Caribbean. On the 2nd of September 2025, US forces carried out the first known strike on a boat alleged to be carrying illicit drugs off the coast of Venezuela. It was the first in a wave of US strikes on vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, targeting alleged narco-terrorists. Reports suggest that more than 100 people have been killed in the strikes over the last 4 months of 2025.
These go-fast boats, as well as slower vessels such as bulk carriers, fishing boats, are indeed used to smuggle cocaine from the Venezuelan coast, the end destination of the immense majority of that cocaine being Europe and not the United States. The strikes disrupted the networks in the Caribbean. I mean, we've heard of it. It's been documented in the press. We've been conducting interviews that confirmed it. And we can assume that those networks have surely reorganized themselves to move the cocaine in other ways. We can also imagine that trafficking will resume if, for example, the US strikes don't go on forever.
Then on the 3rd of January 2026, the United States military carried out a coordinated airstrike against multiple targets in Venezuela, including military facilities and airfields around Caracas. Early that morning, explosions were heard across the capital. And it was reported by the Venezuelan government that more than 100 people were killed, including 32 Cuban soldiers and security personnel who were protection officers for Nicolás Maduro. The removal of Nicolás Maduro was an example of the kingpin strategy, which involves removing the head of a criminal organization.
The kingpin strategy, in fact, generates more violence because you tend to destabilize existing arrangements precisely of how criminal markets operate. The proposed policy that rather than focusing on alleged kingpin that symbolically can make headlines is that if you really want to weaken these structures, you ought to remove these management structures, and you would want to have an operation, for instance, that goes after many people at the managerial level at the same time. The concern is, again, that while symbolically it can mean a lot, especially to some law enforcement organizations, we know that the kingpin strategy tends to produce more violence and does not eliminate the criminal market that it seeks to eliminate.
US President Donald Trump described the strikes as part of an operation to dismantle narcotics trafficking infrastructure and apprehend Maduro. In the 2 weeks following Maduro's extraction, President Trump said this:
"We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition."
Though at the same time, Vice President of Venezuela, Delcy Rodríguez, was sworn in as interim president, and both her administration and the US have committed to working together despite some strong rhetoric on both sides.
No, but she's cooperating.
The president appears to have shifted his focus towards securing access to Venezuela's oil production, a move that many view as the primary objective of the operation with far-reaching geostrategic implications. On the 30th of January, a new hydrocarbons bill was signed into law by interim President Rodríguez, which opened up the country's oil sector to foreign private investment. In response, the Trump administration eased sanctions on the Venezuelan oil industry and reopened the commercial airspace over the country.
American citizens will be very shortly able to go to Venezuela, and they'll be safe there.
The Venezuelan oil sector, largely run by the state oil company PDVSA, has suffered from significant mismanagement and corruption scandals. The recent PDVSA crypto case involving former oil minister Tarek El Isami, who, it's alleged, used his position to carry out illegal oil sales before laundering the illicit funds through cryptocurrency and real estate. Estimates put the cost of this scandal alone well into the billions of US dollars. The aging infrastructure has seen corrupt officials allow criminal groups to dismantle facilities and sell the scrap metal. Fuel theft is also a real concern, with figures estimating that in collaboration with corrupt local officials, fuel mafias in some regions steal up to 30% of fuel. The future for Venezuela and the US's genuine intentions or commitment to combating drug trafficking in the region is impossible to know. The operating environment has changed, and not just when it comes to drug trafficking.
Intersections between drugs, gold, and now potentially oil. We see this in Brazil already, where the PCC is heavily involved in fuel smuggling. There's also precedent in the region of the ELN attacking oil pipelines as well in Colombia. So there's every prospect of similar dynamics coming into play in Venezuela, particularly as we're seeing the larger criminal groups in the region generating a lot of revenue from the illicit gold trade over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think we're going to start to see the effects of that, their kind of cash-heavy approach now, their ability to exert coercion in this kind of strange power vacuum that's likely to emerge in Venezuela.
The gold economy in Venezuela, which generates an estimated $2.2 billion a year, links political elites and military officials who exploit the industry to line their own pockets, and organized criminal groups compete to control mining sites, trafficking routes, and offer protection. And despite Maduro's removal, these systems remain in place.
So a lot of the buyers on the Venezuelan side that are buying just with the people from Brazil and Guyana are Venezuelan military officials, and they're buying gold at a pretty substantial market price, so higher than international gold prices. So they're basically creating an incentive system for illicit gold mining networks in Brazil and in Guyana, who are massive criminal organizations, to go and sell their assets in Venezuela and not sell their illicit gold in Brazil and Guyana. And this tri-border region of Brazil, Venezuela, and Guyana is kind of now becoming this major route, both for gold and increasingly for drugs as well. So for now, the regime mostly remains in place, right? So by all accounts, these same Venezuelan military officials who had been at the forefront of these links are still in place.
Weapons from Venezuela have been trafficked to countries like Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, a region with its own security issues. As organized criminal syndicates look for new trafficking routes, there are concerns they could capitalize further on instability emanating from Venezuela.
Haiti is an interesting and probably an attractive location if you want to traffic either cocaine and probably especially, I would say this in firearms right now, there is demand for that. If someone is able to, organize new connections between Haiti and Venezuela on firearms trafficking, I'm sure we will end up finding that ammunition and firearms will end up in Haiti, which is, of course, a massive concern.
In neighboring Colombia, President Gustavo Petro and US President Trump have had an uneasy relationship for some time.
He has cocaine mills. He has factories where he makes cocaine. And yeah, I think I stick by my first statement. He's making cocaine and they're sending it into the United States. So he does have to watch his ass.
Colombia has its own internal struggles with powerful armed groups intimately involved in the illicit economy, particularly cocaine trafficking. And it's unclear what impact the change in Venezuela will have. After the US operation to capture Maduro and the war of words between the presidents of the US and Colombia, prominent FARC dissident leader Ivan Mordisco called for an alliance of dissident groups against any US action against Colombia.
What will be the consequence of this new equilibrium in the Venezuela regime regarding the relationship with other criminal groups? So they had a fragile but functioning order that now is broken. So what will be this new alignment will tell us what will happen also with organized criminal groups, not only in Venezuela, but in the region, particularly for the case of Colombia and Brazilian groups.
Armed groups such as the ELN and FARC dissident groups have long operated on both sides of the Colombia-Venezuelan border. Former President Hugo Chavez maintained friendly relations with both groups. The ELN have in particular capitalized on this and become further entrenched in illicit economies in Venezuela. The arrest of Maduro led Colombia to close the border with Venezuela, deploying 30,000 troops to the region, with fears that the uncertainty and instability could lead to further migration out of the country and into Colombia. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, 7.9 million Venezuelans have left the country since 2014, the majority settling in other countries in the region. Human trafficking networks controlled by Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua and Colombian groups are known to exploit vulnerable migrants. Brazilian organized criminal group, the PCC, are reported to do the same over the southern border in Brazil, where some are recruited to work in drug trafficking or illegal mining.
All these illicit markets are in a certain way intertwined. I mean, you don't have on one hand, cocaine going out, on the other hand, arms trafficking getting in. But I mean, it's all, let's say, like a supply and demand. These are criminal markets really interconnected, and criminal actors that may have, for instance, a participation in terms of drug trafficking, but also in terms of migrant traffic.
Meanwhile, US strikes have continued. On the 23rd of January, a vessel was targeted after US Southern Command claimed it was engaging in narco-trafficking operations. 2 people were killed. So Maduro is gone, but the regime is still in place under now Interim President Delcy Rodríguez. So what happens in Venezuela from here is unknown.
I'm a little bit optimistic because with the result of what the democratic elections and a free election and fair elections can happen in Venezuela, because many things can be organized. We have seen, and also in the border with Brazil, they just remove the authorities, the legal authorities that have been elected for another government to control the area. So when that happened, I want to see what happened when the elections happen in Venezuela with free and fair, how these the reinstitution of Venezuela can be developed in that order, how armed groups are going to react to that, because they have been there because the government allowed them to stay there.
The consequences of the events of this year are yet to be seen, but one thing's for certain. For the underworld of the global illicit economy, the operating environment has changed substantially, and there will be ramifications.